it's certainly possible to squander what's best about us by constraining us and impeding us from being our best selves, to put it crudely. I would contend it's also possible to squander that human, the best of what we can be, by an excess of liberation. That it's possible to go the other way as well, and that there are better and worse ways to live, bluntly, in accordance with how we can best flourish as human organisms in the context of the entire gestalt of where we are in our evolutionary, cultural, etc. trajectories. So I would contend that it's not just liberation, but it's also the beneficial constraints which enable us to live well, that bring us to a good place and where we can flourish.
Oh, I 100% agree with you on this. That liberty can actually be toxic. This is why I use a nebulous term like meaningful liberation, right? Because it is absolutely possible. And in fact, we may be drowning in trivial liberation. We are so overrun with choice that we don't even recognize that it's a matter of scale in some sense. And I believe this is actually a theme that is in your book, that in some sense, where you see feminism having gone awry, it has in some sense become obsessed with the liberty of individual females and has effectively abandoned responsibility for anything durable and continuing. I mean, right down to its subordination of children to the liberty of their would-be mothers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And I mean, when I titled the book "Feminism Against Progress," the progress which I'm talking about is specifically that vision of the good, which proposes to liberate us from ever more of the constraints that surround us, including, where necessary, the beneficial ones, and which does so, generally speaking, via technologies which replace previously embodied limits or social limits with a technological freedom. You know, whether that's the entire trajectory of industrialization, which liberated humans from all manner of probably pretty arduous subsistence life in favor of, you know, the great panoply of different things that people do with themselves now. But what I've set out to argue is that when you liberate people, when you use a technology to free people or cultures from constraints, what invariably comes with freedom is also trade, which is to say, when you remove something from, and I've argued this really from Karl Polanyi, who's a political economist. He wrote I don't know if you're familiar with The Great Transformation, which is a 1947, I think, book he wrote about the origins of market society. You know, he set out to challenge the idea that Homo economicus was anything universal or eternal about Homo economicus, and set out to show how this figure was constructed and the society in which this figure existed had been constructed, principally through the enclosure of the commons in the United Kingdom. So I've drawn heavily from Karl Polanyi and also from Ivan Illich's work on pre-modern sex roles, where he talks about the Industrial Revolution bringing with it a transition from what he calls vernacular gender to economic sex, in which he sees women as not more empowered but less empowered, because they're structurally disadvantaged in a world which claims that everybody is broadly interchangeable, where our reproductive role and our often desired caring obligations leave us structurally disadvantaged. I mean, this is an extremely reductive summary of an immensely rich book, which if you've not read, I strongly recommend dipping into. Ivan Illich on gender. He was very cancelled for it in the 1990s. So anyway, this is all to say that where we've got to with the women's movement, which emerged rightly and justly in response to a number of ways that women genuinely were faced with new predicaments as material circumstances changed. It has what it's brought. What it has tracked the two things were going on. On the one hand, we've got the broader trajectory of freedom underwritten by technology, which then enables the market to move into places which have been previously governed by social codes. And I've told the paradigmatic example there is the pre-modern guilds, which were replaced by a free market. Again, this is very crudely drawn from Polanyi, but this is this is the and what I've set out to argue is that from the sexual revolution onwards, that movement to liberate us using technology and which we have tacitly accepted invariably comes with a side order of increased commerce, has moved from being something which happens outside in the world with the enclosure of the commons and then the enclosure of various natural resources and this extractive approach to the natural world, which has powered our immense growth in technology and wealth, in abundance, in material goods, and so on. And that turned inwards with the sexual revolution and took as its focus and took as its resource to be enclosed and commodified the human body, and that this was an absolutely pivotal cultural moment, which has been hugely underpriced, hugely under. We don't really we haven't reckoned with at all just how radical that transformation was. The point at which we stopped strip mining the world and we started strip mining ourselves, and I've situated that in the digital and the sexual revolutions, which formed twin facets of essentially the same cultural change, which I've characterized as the cyborg era. And the part 2 of the book, I've set out to unpack some of the ways that we've emancipated ourselves using digital and reproductive technologies. And inexorably with that, although it's brought a great dividend of freedom and many changes which have been positive, at least for some people, it's also brought with it a side order of commerce and the entry of trade into areas where previously it was very strictly managed or just outright forbidden. But it's noticeable, for example, in the concurrent flourishing of sexual emancipation and pornography and the porn industry. The two come into being simultaneously, and it's fairly obvious why. And that's only accelerated in the years since. And I've set out to suggest that there are some undercounted costs of that emancipation, particularly in where it leaves our very long, essentially our evolved patterns in mate choice. And it's created some increasingly painful tensions, which are having now noticeably negative downstream consequences for young people who would otherwise long to form families, but find themselves culturally set up to do pretty much anything but now.
Yes, I can't help but hear a sort of classic British understatement of the catastrophe. Without leaping to conclusions here, I wouldn't say that progress is impossible, but I would say that there is something quite stunning about the degree to which we do not look at our obvious freedoms and make the calculation about what their apparent cost has been. Because I think I share with you a sense that we have taken things that are effectively beyond price and we have commodified them. And while the upshot of that is not the same for every person, there are people who are obviously spectacularly liberated and do something meaningful with it. But for most people, there appears to be no awareness of what has been taken from them. And, nowhere is this more obvious to me than the spectacular decline in the bargaining position that most women find themselves in, right? They have been commodified and do not seem to recognize it. And, I'm obviously not in a great place to say that as a man, but, I guess we could make the same argument for you. There's an irony in your making this case because you're obviously a woman taking advantage of an era in which a woman finds herself in a position to make this case on a world stage, right? That does seem to be I would regard that as a kind of progress. But nonetheless, it gives you a position from which to make the case that maybe the net effect of all of what we regard as progress has not been positive.
Absolutely. And it's certainly, when you look at when you look at what we've traded off, particularly in the era, specifically in the terrain of women's bodies, in exchange for the considerable gains in emancipation, I find the ledger very difficult. I find it very difficult to say that it's been a net gain.